All right, so we're getting more or less everybody. Anyone more out there? No? So, yeah. Let's check if it's anyone else is out there. Getting ready. Yep. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to NUPI Cybersecurity Center for yet another exciting seminar. Today we're going to talk about cyber operations, not only in your own systems, but other systems. And the question is, how does the US Cyber Command wish to position itself in cyberspace? And the persistent engagement, which is the key word here, which is a new word that has emerged in the new cybersecurity doctrine. So the United States issued a number of documents and issues last year. I tried to count. It's like a vision from the Cyber Command, a special the presidential, I don't know what to call it, decision or something. The Department of Defense came with a strategy which is classified, but there's like a short version of it. The national cybersecurity is out, and a couple of other things as well. So lots of things happened last year in the US when it comes to cybersecurity. And what is interesting about them, which we're going to talk about today, is this new language of defense forward and persistent engagement, which means somehow that United States want to engage those that attack United States in their own systems, as I understand it. Now, this is complicated. It's legally complicated, but also it might have implications for allies like us. A lot of things to learn and think about, but this is the way the world is moving, so it's really important that we are on top of it. We have the best expert in the world on this, I think, today, because he has written a lot of it and has a critical stance to it. It's Max Smits. So now I got to read your bio because I always get this wrong, right? So you're a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies in Zurich with Miriam Dunn-Cavalty, who's been here at least once or twice. You're also affiliated with Stanford University at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. That's where you used to be before we moved to Zurich not so long ago. And you're also at Oxford University as an associate at the Center for Technology and Global Affairs. I believe that Lucas Keller is it. You've always also been here. So it's a family of academics who discuss these topics together with us, and that's really appreciated. So we'll do it the normal way. Max will talk, give a presentation, then I'll have some questions and Q&A, and of course prepare your questions. This is a good opportunity to ask questions. We are streaming this live, so if you miss something, you can always go back on the web and look at it later on. So with no further ado, Max, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here here at NUPI. It's my first time here, and I'm enjoying it already. So as Carsten Friis mentioned, I'm going to talk about the US strategy of persistent engagement and provide an assessment of kind of where it came from, where it is now, and what the implications are. In a way, I've written a couple of pieces on this, especially op-eds. There's now an article coming out as well, and it's also a way of a journey of kind of actually becoming from in a way being a proponent of it to being a bit more of a critic over the last 1.5 years since I have engaged with the new strategy, organized workshops around this in Stanford, DC, and in Amsterdam, and engaged regularly with the community both in the US and beyond that on this issue. So let me put the outline and the argument kind of up front. So first, I want to briefly talk about the rationale behind persistent engagement and defend forward, what it means. I think people often get it wrong, and certainly make the case that this is a fundamental change in strategy, certainly from what we've seen between 2010 and 2018 in the US. And then I'm going to talk about the operational implications. So what does it really mean for its change in operational behavior from the US side? Where I'm going to talk about the discussion around maneuvering in wherever the adversary maneuvers, and that the US is now no longer an observer or passerby also in allied networks, but an actively disruptor seeking to achieve effects. Then I'm going to talk about the potential outcomes, talking about where is it most likely that they will actually cause friction, what they seek to achieve. Where do they believe are the red lines? How do they believe that they can seek norms through what they call persistent engagement, through practice? And then I'm going to have a special focus on the implications for allies. and where we might see allied friction to occur. Finally, I'm going to briefly talk about how to move forward. I'm going to argue that at least the NATO MOU on computer network attacks might be one way forward, although it's certainly not a silver bullet. Please feel free to interrupt me in between if you have any kind of clarifying questions. I'm not sure exactly where the audience stands. Might be a good question. Has anyone read the US Cyber Command vision, or at least the DoD summary of the DoD strategy? Just can we have a show of hands so I kind of have a sense? 3, 4 people. Okay. We'll take it at one at a time. So you can say that 2010 in the US was really a fundamental changing year in that it led to the recognition of cyberspace as a domain of warfare, similar to the other domains of warfare, air, land, navy, and sea and space. And then also the creation of, or at least the official creation of US Cyber Command. It wasn't that the United States wasn't thinking about conducting cyber effects operations before, but it was this kind of fundamental change. Back then, the US Cyber Command until 2018 was under STRATCOM, Strategic Command, which is responsible for the US nuclear capabilities. And it was very much from this lineage of the late 90s that there was this focus, okay, we're setting up this command and we're going to get cyber deterrence right. How do we do this in this space? Alongside 2 other concepts, how can we propose these kind of new norms in cyberspace, and how can we be more resilient? The focus was primarily on critical infrastructure attacks, something that came up from the late 90s, not through actually a cyber attack, but through the Oklahoma City bombing, where this notion was, okay, how can we make sure that the US doesn't cripple from the cyber attack, thinking about the big statements around cyber Pearl Harbor, and so on. This one big hit, similar to a kinetic strike, that could take out the US critical infrastructure. And the belief was, and actually still is, of course, today, is that the US being so interconnected is perhaps the most vulnerable to cyber attacks. In case anyone is interested, a key piece that was written back then in 2010, which really kind of set this scene, was from Bill Lynn on defending a new domain, which kind of sets this out. We need to deter better. We need to think about how adversaries could potentially take down the power grid, et cetera, et cetera. Now, from 2010 to 2018, you didn't see much of a change in at least the strategic thinking. And you also actually saw that in the academic literature. The academic literature was very much one about, does cyber war take place or not, right? And this kind of further development of a deterrence strategy, to what degree is attribution necessary to deter? How can we make sure, again, that Iranian or North Korean or Chinese actors won't go above the threshold of armed attack? What can we do to prevent that? And there was this continuous focus, to repeat myself here, on a catastrophic event. Of course, from 2010 until 2018, we saw a number of additional developments as well, not least organizational developments within US Cyber Command, moving from almost no cyber mission forces to up to late 2018, where they are fully operational with 133 cyber mission forces. And in addition to this, we saw the most significant cyber action against ISIS. I think a target that you can say is a hard target with a relatively little target space and what you can achieve, and people within US Cyber Command and beyond are divided as to how effective the US government was in actually conducting cyber attacks against ISIS to, in this case, particularly limit their ability to propagate or disseminate propaganda from ISIS and recruit actors around the world. I don't want to talk about that today, although please feel free to ask me any questions you may have on that later. So what has changed? So here the focus is very much, again, on deterrence. It's changing potentially the perception, the cost-benefit analysis of our adversaries, and it's putting it very much in the kind of conventional framework in which the US has thought also about its use of nuclear weapons, about potential other capabilities as well. And perhaps that's also not strange from a kind of organizational perspective, because until 2018, US Cyber Command was directly under Stratcom, and Stratcom's mission for nuclear capabilities is simply to deter. So that's the pre-2018. Now in 2018, two rather significant documents came out, at least if you look at the way they were written. The first was, came the US Cyber Command vision to achieve and maintain cyberspace superiority. And then there was also the summary of the DoD strategy. The key focus of the key word that came out of the Cyber Command vision was this notion of persistent engagement, which we'll explain in a second. And defend forward was the key notion that came out of the US Cyber Command summary of the strategy. And the fundamental rationale behind this new strategy, and of course had to do with some of the developments we've seen during the elections, but before that too, was not so much the focus on a catastrophic event, but it was really about adversaries conducting cyber operations below the threshold of armed attack, but that's still being strategically meaningful. And the key focus there was very much one of saying, we've been so focused on this potentially attacks that cripple infrastructure, but really what is going on are these activities that we have kind of sliced up. Some of it we see as cybercrime, some of it we might even, in an extreme case, see as cyber terrorism, all of that. But realistically, we should see them potentially by certain, at least, adversaries as broader cyber operations that can be linked into one broader campaign. And by missing out on that, we do not realize what the full extent is of the strategic activity in this space. Now, to deal with that activity taking place below the threshold of armed attack, the US seeks to achieve and sustain overmatch of adversaries' capabilities, and as I will get to in a second, seeks to achieve superiority through cyberspace. There is an importance here in words. They didn't want to pick supremacy, which is ultimate kind of control over the space, but use superiority, recognizing that our actors still operate in this. And so where they moved away, as we'll get to now, from resilience and deterrence, they moved from those two concepts, they primarily moved to concepts of persistent engagement and defend forward. Meaning, if all this activity takes place below the threshold of armed attack, what the US should do is also, in particular US Cyber Command, operate to make sure that all those activities cannot be linked into one broader campaign. We need to cause friction in this kind of space below the threshold of armed attack to ensure that that adversaries do not get the strategic effects that they want to. And so it's no longer about cyber war, but it's about, as this graph shown in the document itself as well, it's about this big kind of iceberg that it might not always be seen in public, that is equally crucial. And so, of course, two big cases can come to mind, right? The first one is, of course, relates to Russian disinformation operations, where there have been a number of hearings, and certainly US Cyber Command commanders have expressed frustration, where the idea is that maybe one tweet doesn't have a significant effect, but doing this systematically over time can potentially lead to at least a loss of confidence in democracies in certain countries, etc., etc. The other well-known case that comes to mind is, of course, Chinese cyber espionage operations, stealing 1 or 2 gigabytes of information from maybe one company might not necessarily have any strategic effects, but doing this over a longer period of time of 10, 20 years, doing this systematically can have real implications for the US economy, for the military, and so on, and wouldn't be initially considered in this kind of strategic framework of deterrence that the US had in mind before. Less obvious cases, which I think are actually more interesting to analyze under this framework, are, for instance, the OPM, the Anthem breach, United Airlines and Marriott. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with the OPM breach, but the OPM breach was a breach that took place in the US and stole not too many records, between 11 and 12 million records of US government employees. And they need to fill out this form and tell basically everything they know before they get clearance, everything they know about themselves. But they also interview friends, family, and so on, to build this complete record, to understand whether a person or not can get a certain clearance, with, of course, an enormous amount of information in those documents, alcohol abuse, all these kind of debt, all these kind of things. Stealing that information in and of itself, even though these are 11 million records, that is valuable, gives you a sense of potentially who got clearances, but above all, who you might be able to, who you might be able to engage with for potential spying activities, who you might be able to pay a couple of grand in case they have debt, etc., etc. That is, it's in and of itself, so that is said to be allegedly the Chinese state-sponsored actor which was behind that, but it has always been seen as a separate case. The key point here is this notion that, hey, no, we should link that to a broader set of operations that we know as well. For instance, the Anthem breach, where, I don't know, hundreds of millions of records were stolen around healthcare of US people. Think about the United Airlines, which again gives you an enormous amount of information about not only where government officials travel, but people beyond that. And then you have the Marriott breach, which to my knowledge now is the most significant breach that has occurred at least in the last 2 years, which then gives you further information of where people stay. Now, all that combined gives you a pretty comprehensive picture of some of the people in US government, US intel, who they meet, when they meet, etc. Whereas before they were often sliced up. So this is the kind of broader notion that underlies the US strategy. And I think it has something right there. There used to be this very strong focus of putting cyber, again, only questioning whether it has the same kinetic effects. I think the US got it right here in being aware that the threat environment is fundamentally different when it comes to cyber and what it can achieve. And so what are the operational implications? So if you believe that there is a lot of activity taking place below the threshold of armed attack, the US then seeks to cause friction in these operations to make sure that they can't be linked into campaigns and get these broader effects. More specifically, they seek to achieve and sustain overmatch in adversaries' capabilities and ensure superiority through persistence. And this is where you see a slight separation in the concepts also about defend forward and persistent engagement, which are sometimes used as synonymous. So persistent engagement, at least in the early writing, is very much about where you act. About when you act, which is basically all the time. You want to act whenever your adversary acts. Defend forward is primarily about where you act. And where you act is basically you want to maneuver wherever your adversary maneuvers. If you, in a way, combine the two, you could say the US wants to operate at any point in time, anywhere, wherever the adversary is. And what they want to do, and this is again different from the conventional deterrence framework, the deterrence notion is very much one, we want to change the cost-benefit analysis, the perception of our adversaries, right? If you do X, then we come back and we retaliate and we do Y, and based on that cost-benefit analysis, you don't want to do that activity. But here, with persistent engagement and defend forward, it's not so much about changing the cost-benefit analysis, because that's kind of assumed. It's assumed that adversaries will constantly engage with the US government. Now what you want to do is cause friction. You want to take away their capabilities, or you want to make sure that they can't achieve these effects. If you ask me why is it assumed that adversaries constantly engage with the United States, that's where you get into the argument also in the academic literature from Richard Hargnett, Emily Goldman, Michael Fisher-Keller, that this is a space of constant contact, where basically contact between adversaries, where there are so many opportunities for adversaries and allies to interact, that and it's relatively easy to do, that we should not think that we can have this kind of static dimension where one actor is kind of waiting for the other to punch. We're already in this space where people are constantly punching and punching back. So even a notion, a static notion, again, of deterrence, where you say, we do X to potentially dissuade an adversary to conduct an activity, already far past this point. The other point made, well-known analogy that frequently comes up, is that of wrestling, of basketball, where it's very tough to know where offense starts and defense ends. In this space, in the case of wrestling, where is it exactly the kind of clearly defined lines of when are you on top of it? If you're on top of an adversary or of a person, are you then winning or not? It really depends, and it's not clearly, the lines are not clearly defined, as it is in often other spaces as well. Of course, it also has to do with territory, where there is no clear distinction there. So it's a big shift in the way that is conceived on how you want to achieve strategic effects, and you get all these kind of notions that as was mentioned in a broader set of documents, also in a joint forces quarterly piece of General Nakasone, who heads both NSA and US Cyber Command, about operating seamlessly, globally, and continuously. And at least the piece that he has written himself, he says, you know, also with the Navy, we don't keep our Navy at our harbor, but we are out there, and we are constantly kind of patrolling the seas. The argument is, at least, that we should do this with our cyber forces as well. So it's to seize the initiative, retain momentum, and disrupt adversaries' freedom of action. Superiority through persistence seizes and maintains the initiative, again, in cyberspace by continuously engaging and contesting adversaries and causing them uncertainty wherever they maneuver. And then there is a phrase that frequently comes up, although it has changed for anyone who has been very closely watching this. It's about operating either at the source or as close as source to the adversaries and their operations, whatever that's supposed to mean, which we can get to in a second. So that's the notion. We want to be out there, we want to be more active, and of course this also comes, again, like there is a strategic question here, but there is a sense of frustration there as well. So if anyone has seen the inaugural kind of hearing or read about it from General Nakasone, who, when he became head of US Cyber Command, there was a sense of frustration, particularly that the US wasn't really able to do anything during and even after the DNC hack of the Democratic National Committee, and broader operations that Russia were conducting. And so there was this feeling like we need to be more active. What I'm cautious here, I don't want to use necessarily the word aggressive, which some have quickly put on this strategy. It's a more aggressive strategy. It's certainly more active. Whether it is more aggressive can, from the strategy itself, cannot be immediately delineated. And the reason for that is that you can argue to achieve superiority, to kind of have, to achieve overmatch and to be in control, you could do potentially through both offensive acts and defensive acts. That's, at least from the strategy, you wouldn't be able to draw the conclusion what exactly the type of means are. The analogy that I've used once before is of Muhammad Ali, where you can say that he is in control by, on the one hand, constantly maybe punching the adversary, and as a result of that being in control of the match. But equally, there have been famous photos where he has his hands on his back. He's not he's rather defensive, but he's still kind of controlling the match, wearing the opponent out. So that's some of the operational implications. Now, what have we seen under that? We will discuss in a second as well. Any questions so far? I'm trying to get a sense of where everyone stands and if I'm going too fast or not. All good? And so when we then assess the potential outcomes of this strategy, where do we think this may go? The first one is that let me actually already go to the next slide. So to take one step back, so the US believes that over time, it has moved from kind of the position where this was a relatively stable domain, where they were not necessarily losing out, to a space that has become ever more unstable. We see ever more adversaries conducting operations, particularly below the threshold of armed attack. And that's really weakened the US strategic position. And the US has not really realized that. So they have moved away from this position to a position that they, in a way, don't want to be in. You could almost say that at least in cyberspace, the US now is a revisionist actor, wants to go back to a potential status quo that once existed. Right? So, and what they want to do with the new strategy is do two things. They believe that persistent engagement, one, leads to more stability. As is stated, more secure and all the kind of old notions of secure and open, all those kind of things, more norms, and leads to more strategic effects, improves US position, right? Now, if you think through, in simple terms, through the outcomes that are possible, you can think that the US strategy of persistent engagement leads indeed to a win-win, where indeed the strategy leads to more stability. By constantly engaging with the adversary is the notion that they can come up with new rules of the road. And also adversaries realize that at certain areas they shouldn't go. And secondly, it can improve US position in terms of strategic effect as well. Now, of course, there are also lose-win, win-lose, and lose-lose scenarios out there. And so when we think about the kind of consequences of it, I've put them here in 4 buckets. The first one is that the US actually is able to cause significant friction in adversaries' operation that you can call persistent engagement and defend forward successful. That they constantly are where the adversary is, and as a result of that, adversaries almost don't want to engage with the US anymore in this space. Now, I think my current stance on this, and I haven't certainly not well formulated this in any writing, is that I actually think that from a friction perspective, the US strategy is much more likely to succeed in some cases and much, much less likely to succeed in others. And we've kind of put this all in one kind of big kind of question. Is it able to cause friction or not? But I think in realistic terms, I think what we'll see is that against certain campaigns and certain actors, it's much easier than against others. More specifically, I think it will. So the US has tried to prioritize, right, and has picked out the 4 main actors. So the 4 main actors: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And that's where we primarily want to persistently engage with. But just looking at those 4, so they don't want to necessarily, at least that's the official line, not necessarily persistently engage with non-state actors. And why is because they believe that they can't achieve too many strategic effects. Going back, the reason why I think also against these 4 actors, why friction is much easier to occur than others, is if you think about China, China of course is not a unitary actor. We're thinking of at least 100 different state sponsored or directly state-connected groups. To persistently engage with all of them is incredibly difficult. And more specifically, if you think about the type of operations, I don't really know what it means if you're talking about making sure that these operations cannot be linked into campaigns. In many of these cases, it's very hard to know. Once, for instance, with economic espionage, once your data is gone, of course you might maybe at the very back end make sure that some of that information can't be absorbed into the broader economy. But it's really, really tough. It's often also inherently covert. And you've got a wide set of actors that once you take capabilities away, they can easily come back with a new with new tooling. The ability to kind of regenerate is incredible, especially over the last few years. And if anyone is interested in it, there's a terrific report on what is called the Quartermaster, one organization in China that supplies many of the main tools and infrastructure to other actors that operating under the Chinese umbrella. Having said that, if you think about actors which we know have very few operators and developers, and particularly developers who work on their tooling, and of which Russia is one of them. We know of a number from the indictments that you have literally one person who over years is building some of its main tools, at least for the state itself. There potentially, and doing it like disinformation operations are inherently much more overt. You will have to do this on an ongoing and systematic basis. There potentially friction is more likely to succeed. So it's not an easy question of will it work, friction or not, and against whom does it. The second one is the question that has received, certainly initially, and also for me, but from the US scholars, the most attention. So how much does this lead to escalation? And particularly how much does it lead to escalation with of course, China and Russia, but also with other actors, this kind of great power conflict. Now, one could, I think there are a number of things to be said here, but I think the best point, in my view, has been made by Jay Healy, which has argued really like, when do you know that the US is punching first, and when do you know it's punching back? And more specifically, how do you know this of adversaries? From their perspective, and many times they are punching back and not punching first. From a public's perspective, it's for any academic or any expert in this space very, very hard to tell. In fact, what is the case is that we often, as experts here, have a much better, or are much more likely to hear of an adversarial campaign against a Western entity than of a US campaign against, for instance, Iran or not. And so it's very easy to then draw conclusions, as we've potentially done in the cases of Shamoon and so on, where we say, hey, this is clear aggression coming from a certain country like Iran, whereas from that country's perspective, it's much more one of punching back. There are other questions there, right? If you truly, to what degree does a strategy that from the outside certainly looks as if the US wants to, and as they explicitly say, engage so much more with the adversaries. To what degree does it enable domestic constituencies within those countries to then go back and say, see, this is why we need a much bigger budget for cyber warfare units. It's a very much kind of potential enabling actor or enabling device there for those countries, whether the US does more or less in this space. There are other questions there. To what degree does it create a further, what Ben Buchanan uses, to what degree does it create a further kind of cybersecurity dilemma in this space, where we don't know really what the intentions are of each other. Third is this question around red lines. And so this is an important one, because the US, specifically US Cyber Command, is proposing a different way of establishing norms through this strategy. As I said, they want to achieve two things, right? As they explicitly say. One is achieve strategic effects, we want to go back up, and we want to create more stability, we want to create more norms in this space. From the writing that has been published so far, also from academics who have been in US Cyber Command and are now out, there is this notion that you can establish norms not through the kind of formal, maybe UN processes, very much top-down, but norms, as they would say, through practice. We can create a notion of agreed competition by constantly engaging with the adversary, and through that we can get to certain focal points of where adversaries are and are not allowed to go. That's the current notion that at least has been published in two pieces from Richard Hognan and Michael Fischer-Keller, two of the main people who also helped to write the strategy. If not, they were perhaps the most influential authors of it. I've been critical particularly about this notion for one main reason, and that is that if you are saying that all this activity below the threshold of armed attack can be strategically meaningful, and beforehand, if you would go back to the OPM, you don't know whether OPM will lead to cumulative significance and how this can be linked into broader campaigns, or whether this is another operation. But the notion very much is that all this activity below the threshold of armed attack, we really need to deal with it. It then becomes very clear on what is then actually the space in which adversaries are allowed to operate, right? So it's very clear then unclear to me of what China is allowed to do in this space. They are not allowed to do any activity that for them achieves a certain strategic effect. But it's hard to conceive of activity that they want to do that for them is not strategically beneficial or weakens the US position. Now, it might not be a total zero-sum game in this world, but it's very tough to kind of conceive of those two. And if that's the case, if you really think that all that activity below the threshold of armed attack can be linked again into these broader campaigns, then it opens up this question of well, you're basically constantly engaging with them, and you're not setting red lines, not because you're not clear on if you do X, we punish you, but because you constantly engage with them below the threshold as well. To draw a potentially bad analogy, it's kind of like driving through red light, right? It's a very clear signal. If you drive through red light, we'll give you a fine, right? And every single time that someone drives through red light, you give that person a fine, and it's clear, okay, I shouldn't drive through red light. But what you're doing here is, well, also in cases when someone drives through green and orange light, we'll give them a fine. And so the line then also between when you are allowed to drive through red light or not becomes very muddy. And I think that's very much the danger that we see here today with this creation of kind of norms through practice, re-establishing focal points of where you're allowed to go, and this argument that we are going to engage wherever the other adversary wants to achieve a strategic effect. The last one is about this loss of allied trust, which I want to draw particular attention. So, to take it in two steps. So, the US Cyber Command seeks to achieve effects that are outside of their own networks, as they have made explicit, and also beyond the networks of their adversaries. They want to maneuver where the adversary maneuvers, and the adversary doesn't just maneuver in their own networks. They maneuver far beyond that. Now, that space, very clearly, is not kind of a gray blob or whatever it is. It's not ungoverned space, right? We're talking here about routers in Denmark or servers in Norway or other operating infrastructure in another country, in Nairobi, you name it, right? And so when Nakasone draws the analogy with the sea of hey, we need to put our naval ships, we also don't put our naval ships kind of just in our own harbors, but they're kind of patrolling on the sea, that's a flawed analogy in my view, because the sea is indeed a commons, but that's not the case for cyberspace, right? Cyberspace always touches ground somewhere. It's owned by someone. It's not kind of an ungoverned space, right? And so the argument here is pretty straightforward. If the US then wants to maneuver wherever the adversary maneuvers, that has potential severe implications for allies as well. Now, someone may come back and say, yeah, but haven't they always done this? What's really new here? Hasn't the US, we know from maybe the Snowden leaks, the US has always engaged in allied territory. But there is a fundamental difference here, right? The most common thing, which you could almost say everyone does, is being an observer in allied networks, right? And you can do this for a variety of reasons, to potentially gain information on this ally, but most commonly actually to do kind of fourth party collection. You might be in an allied network, not for this allied purposes, but because you want to acquire information from an adversary. So this is the whole kind of espionage case, right? Collecting intel, what we've seen decades long. Then the other way in which we've also seen in the past is being in allied networks as a passerby. It's a little bit similar to kind of overflight rights, although I'm not too familiar with that, where you would go through an allied network to potentially get into adversarial networks, right? You use their nodes. But the key difference here is being an active disruptor, right? It's being in allied networks, and you want to cause friction in adversarial operations, so you want to achieve effects. Achieve effects in the US case is to disrupt, deny, degrade, and or destroy. That is a fundamental difference, particularly if you want to do this and seek to do this at scale in the US case. And so we, at least publicly, are known of only one main case around this, which is written up by Alan Nakashima, a well-known reporter for the Washington Post, where she talked about US in their cyber war against ISIS, at least partially wiping material off a server that was located in Germany. Now, Germany was notified in some form. It's unclear exactly what the notification was, but they clearly didn't consent. Now, there is a certain expectation with particularly this strategy that that's something you will see much more in the future, if it is not already going on, but not publicly disclosed. And so, again, it's not. There is something to be said about what the US argues, and you've seen this at the latest Cyber Command Symposium in 2019. That wasn't in the 2018 symposium that they organized, but it comes back, of course, all the time. It's like, well, we need to do this because opportunities in this space are kind of fleeting. We need to act quickly, and so sometimes we might not be able to go the long diplomatic route because doing it in that way might just take too much time, and we don't have it. There is something to be said about it, and there is also something to be said about operating potentially in allied networks if that ally doesn't care about it and certainly doesn't have the capability at all themselves. You could argue again there that these operations could be strategically beneficial for both actors. But where it really the problem comes in, of course, is when allies are not keen of having the US in the networks. Now, they were already not keen of having the US in the networks for intel collections, certainly not this case. So you get this huge amount of frustration, and I am pretty sure that if not in public, we'll see many more of these cases in the future. And that leads to a real risk here, right? You might achieve your effect of causing friction against your adversaries, even if you would assume that the strategy is going to work. But it does come at a cost, and that cost is much more difficult to measure than some of the discussions that we have been initially having around escalation. And this cost of kind of diplomatic friction with some of the key allies that exist, and that is not easily observable. Its effects are not entirely clear on how that would fire back against the US. And I believe that it's particularly this risk of undermining allies' risk comes at a time already when, at least in most countries in Europe, trust in some parts of US governments is already rather limited. And that shouldn't be taken out of the equation, although many have argued that at least officially and at least initially the US Cyber Command strategy was ruled out independent of who was in the White House. The other key point here is that adversaries do not randomly choose which kind of intermediary nodes they use, right, where they are operating. And so this is where I think another kind of future kind of area of friction will lie. If I am an adversary and I could move through a node in, again, let's say Denmark or Norway or the Netherlands or Germany Or it could do this through a country where the US has less strong diplomatic ties and knows that the consequences will be less significant. Which note will I pick? I will exactly go through those notes where they will feel the most diplomatic pain. And if I would do that, I would exactly use a strategy to exploit the friction internally. And it would be naive to think, if we can come up with that adversaries wouldn't think in those terms as well. In fact, you can make a strong argument that certainly in the disinformation space, we know how well certain adversaries are able to exploit divisions within a society. It would be strange if they wouldn't poke into this one. And so the question then becomes, okay, if this is the case, how to move forward? It's clear that there is, in some ways, no silver bullet, and I think the strongest questions are really here for the US, or the most important ones. It's like, how much do you think that operating in allied space and causing friction is a necessary component of your new strategy, and how much are you willing to give that up to minimize allied friction? And I think that very much depends on who you're asking. But I'm at the moment, from also 2 workshops that I've attended more recently in DC, not overly optimistic. I feel that there is a very strong notion of like, well, first, we don't know actually whether sovereignty applies here, and who knows, that might backfire on them. But 2, also like, okay, yes, so what? So it will cause allies loss of trust. They can't do without us anyway. We don't believe that these risks are very manageable. I feel that this sentiment is stronger now than it was actually even a year ago. But that's only from some anecdotal kind of roundtable workshops and other events. So the initial proposal that I put here is the creation of an MOU between NATO member states, that could be bilateral, as I will discuss, concerning the cooperation of cyber effects operations. So again, it's not just offensive cyber operations, but cyber effects operations that seek to achieve, to disrupt, deny, degrade, and or destroy. And the notion, the scope at least, is that first it should have a common notification equity framework. Can allies agree on when you are allowed to come into each other's system to achieve these effects? What are the key kind of equities that should be taken into consideration? I've put a couple of here that should be taken into consideration, at least if you think through it. Right, the ability of an actor to take action. Could they actually, what is the likelihood that they will actually negate the known threat? What is the imminence and scale of the threat? Again, the ISIS case, which was wiping off propaganda material off a server. You certainly want to do this, prefer to do this today rather than tomorrow. But you can't say that this is about like opportunities that are fleeting, that we have to take down this server today, because otherwise we'll strongly feel the consequences tomorrow. There is no other option here. I really doubt that. And equally, I've put a number of others there. Again, that doesn't solve the question on whether they should operate in at all. But it does, with an assumption that actors can do this, at least negate some of the diplomatic friction that takes place. And there is, of course, a secondary argument there to the US. This kind of open question, like, if the US is allowed to do this, would it allow allies to do the same? Would a European country be allowed to take down a server in Texas because it believes that one of its adversaries is maneuvering there? It hasn't attacked the US yet, but as a strike, it seeks to make sure that it takes down the server because it could be used as a hop-off point of, I don't know, some disinformation material that will get disseminated during an election. Something like that, a data server. I mean, and you will notify the US certainly about it in some way or another, but clearly the US doesn't consent, and not straight away, and you still do it. It's hard for me to believe that the US would be open to such an activity. And so there is this question on to what degree are we dealing here with double standards. Now that might not be unique to cyber, we've seen this in other spaces. And there might be also a kind of a calculated discussion here from the US side. Again, the US has, this strategy has partially come out of an understanding of the threat environment. It also has come out of at least now a much more operational US Cyber Command that is actually able to operate much more globally than it was before. There are very few other countries that are able to do so. But that would be an additional rationale and perhaps a more important argument to also be made on why certainly also from a US perspective some of these common notification frameworks could be beneficial. There are open questions which I think as a first step should be considered whether all these MOUs should be bilateral or not, because there are differences in information sharing and you might not share across NATO. There are other benefits of doing it NATO-wide, again because of exploiting divisions. There's a question of putting these frameworks public, like the vulnerability equity process framework, or not, because it might send a signaling device to adversaries as well. Those questions are left open. I think that's it. I don't think I have any more slides until something has happened between now and last night. Thanks, Carsten.
I think this was really great, awesome. Get a really, I think we learn a lot about how the US has been working on these topics, and of course we all think about should we all do the same. So, from your experience now with working in Europe also, to what extent you know if this is a kind of, I know that Netherlands has been kind of the most active one, is expressing publicly that it should also do, engage cybersecurity in this more persistent engagement approach. Do you see other states doing the same, or?
Sorry, you mean the Netherlands also seeking to?
Yeah, they seem to be somewhat more forward-leaning, if you may use that word. But might be.
So the Netherlands, in some fora, is forward-leaning in pushing back against persistent engagement. They themselves certainly don't have a strategy of persistent engagement, and none of the public documents have seem to have moved in that direction. In fact, the Netherlands is still very much in the old kind of deterrence framework. We need to better deter, as the latest strategy that came out now a year ago stated, of at least the Defense Department, and we need to do better attribution, right? That's the kind of the discussion that you see very much there. With open questions, which we didn't get to now, on like, is more public attribution necessarily better or not? All those questions. In fact, and that goes to a much broader point, right? Although Netherlands might be seen as a rather active actor in this space, we need to acknowledge some of the actual capabilities and operational mandate that lies certainly behind the Dutch Cyber Command, right? And that's not unique in that. Specifically, it's still, after now being fully operational for, not fully operational for several years, it's still struggling to get the right developers, the right operators. It's still, as at least publicly stated by the commander, hasn't independently conducted an operation, and that's also because its mandate comes through the military intelligence service. So it kind of feels that it's kind of almost has become a branch of that. So it's actually struggling operationally, and that's something not unique to the Netherlands, but we've seen this with many other cyber commands or similar units across Europe. And so I wouldn't say that all of this is kind of bark and no bite, but we should carefully distinguish between sometimes, and especially a couple of years ago, what was always publicly announced about the establishment of a new cyber command in country X, Y, or Z, and one country being more active because they have publicly stated that they will contribute to the NATO alliance with their cyber capability, to what they can actually do, what the actual budget is that underlies it. And that's not always
this
great.
Shift in thinking, though, I mean, from kind of deterrence to persistent engagement, Do you see that anywhere else? Is it
So-
only the US at this stage?
Yeah, so you see it in particularly around the Five Eyes. So Canada has published a piece last year where it has not mentioned the word persistent engagement in it, but has been much more explicit about operating beyond the networks where adversaries maneuver, all those kind of questions. And this new framework came into effect, I believe, now 6 months ago. So that's one. And the second one is of course the UK. The UK would certainly, again, hasn't, as the UK has done over the last 10 years, and like other actors, hasn't been overly vocal on what it wants to do, and specifically when it comes to effects operations, but it has been now put a strong stance around sovereignty, which is a stronger one than the US has done, about this notion that sovereignty in cyberspace they didn't put in exactly those terms, doesn't apply. And so that opens the opportunity to conduct more of these type of operations and fit within this framework. Now, there is, again, this question on like who could actually do this? Who else could persistently engage or seek to persistently engage? And you get to a very limited group.
Now, you use this analogy of red traffic lights.
Yeah.
But I just wonder, because there's something here about the public sector and private sector critical infrastructure. So when you say it, it's like, okay, where do you draw the line? Because I guess when it comes to protecting critical infrastructure, it's still the main key from the US point of view, but any Chinese hack in a small company in Texas will not necessarily trigger US Cyber Command engagement. But can you say something more about the private-public dimension here when it comes to the thinking around how to define where the red line is, so to speak?
I think that's probably the key question. It's a terrific question, which I almost intentionally left out here, but it's also very sad to see that, again, with something like an MOU, of course, you can argue that that nation states ultimately have some legal right over some of those companies operating within their sovereign territory. But it is the question on where does the private sector come in with the awareness that 85 to 90%, the figures differ on this, of the operating infrastructure is owned by them. So the discussions that need to be held are as much between states as to what they do for private sector companies. Now, if you ask me what the implications are, I actually don't know, right? Like in the case of the US, are they more likely to persistently engage if this is a US headquartered company which maintains, which owns routers or systems in an allied country, or are they less likely to do this? And what are these discussions going on? It's a very muddy, it's a very unclear kind of situation that is absolutely crucial to further bring in this debate. And I've seen very few actually so far since the establishment, and also before that, some of the initial kind of discussions that are going on, closed door roundtables. You always see these 1 or 2 or 3 private sector actors being in the room, but I don't think that some of them have not woken up to it yet, and equally they're not invited to it, and that's certainly problematic.
I would just thinking when you're talking about the reverse effect that how, for instance, allies could actually engage in the U.S. territory. The big Norwegian hydro hack. It was a hydro aluminum plant, worldwide Norwegian-owned company, but it started off in the U.S. So in theory, we can think that okay, they detected that and rallied Norwegian authorities to assist them, and we could, they could then engage in the U.S. Facility. I don't think that I had that happen, but it's a case that is,
Absolutely, and to be more specific, right? The notion of defend forward and persistent engagement is not one of we have been attacked. We trace back where the adversary is, and then we engage with them. The idea is very much, we need to defend forward before they are in our systems. So you're much more in the preemptive, preventive space, where you're much more saying, like, before they even target a Norwegian company, we believe that it may attack or will attack a Norwegian company and has strategic effects, and hence we take down a server in the US. That is actually the argument that we're having here, which is an even more extreme one.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And again, you talked about how to kind of define, what to go for. You said, of course, China is more difficult than maybe Russia. And typically, we had these APTs, different kind of hacker groups that are loosely connected to, especially Russian actors and others. So, I mean, is that the concrete way they will do it? I mean, it's like, okay, you had this APT, whatever number, cozy bears and this, and you kind of try to engage them and follow them and basically harass them 24/7. Is that operationally how they would go about doing it?
Yeah, I mean, harassing is an interesting word here, right? Like, if you believe you want to take away their capabilities and their ability to conduct an operation, it could go in a variety of ways, right? And one of the easiest ways, and you may question whether this is actually something that the US Cyber Command is supposed to do, is to find to map out their tooling or the broader kind of tools, techniques, and procedures, and to publicly showcase that, to potentially burn those capabilities that they aren't able to use again. That would be a very kind of common understanding of what would fit within persistent engagement. And that's if it's just, for instance, that example of like causing friction, you can already think about in which cases they are able to better do that than in others. So again, if you have an actor that is using a lot of public tools, it doesn't matter too much if you are going to publicly showcase that. They've been using tools that are kind of in the open space already anyway. If you're doing this against an actor that is constantly retooling and using highly specific and conducting very specific and targeted operations, and for that has only a very small set of developers that are actually building their capabilities, well, then you might say, okay, if we can actually burn some of their tools, it may actually really take some time before they can regenerate and go back onto doing what they are supposed to be doing. There is there is one more thing there, right? There is very much this notion of like, if we could flicker their lights when they're operating, it means that then they have to much more think about what they're doing themselves, about their own defenses, and much less about how they can actually attack us. This is kind of very much this notion as well.
And they have to redirect their resources to more defense.
That's the argument, yes.
But the two cases I know about and look recently is this taking out this Russian troll factory before the elections, and this latest Iranian. We don't know much about that, but would that be part of this persistent engagement defense forward, or is that more unique one-off cases?
So the Iranian, so for anyone who's unfamiliar with the two cases, the IRA case is where the US cut off the internet connection, although the specifics are unclear, of the IRA at the moment of the day of the midterm elections. Now, again, yeah, that would. At least the US Cyber Command argument is that very much fits into the persistent engagement framework. And I think it's no coincidence that one has become publicly known, because it's also one that few people will disagree with necessarily. It's clearly in the IRA networks, and it's clearly one where everyone laughs about, everyone dislikes the IRA, so there's very much this kind of notion, okay, it's good. And there is very much, again, this notion of those people then waking up, sitting in front of their computers, and then realize that they can't get on with what they were supposed to do that day. You can then question, however, to what degree does it have an effect, and to what degree does it have a long-term effect? Do you then need to do this every day, and how much will this lead to a certain adaptation? The Iranian case, I am still skeptical of certainly whether this fits within the persistent engagement framework, and to whether the public discussion is the right one around that. So in Iran, the case is that the US retaliated against Iran, not through, of course, conventional means, but did this through a cyber attack against a number of part of their operational infrastructure, more specifically also their missile defense systems, I believe their radar systems, a number of these things. And so one, I don't believe it fits in the persistent engagement framework because it's much more of a deterrence notion. You retaliate, or a compellence notion, and you wanna prevent a future activity from the Iran, and you want to change that cost-benefit analysis. The second one is that I don't even know that this was done instead of a conventional retaliatory strike. And the reason why I'm saying that is that I can't imagine that if you're doing this instead of a retaliatory strike, why would you go after exactly those type of assets which are so connected to conducting a conventional strike yourself? What is more likely and also publicly known is that Trump called off the conventional strike, but cyber operations and conventional operations operate under very different timelines. And so it was kind of like we'll let the cyber operation continue and blow off the conventional the conventional operation, for which it would be very beneficial to take down the radar system, etc. That's I think, much more likely scenario.
Okay, let's see if there are other questions here. This is your chance, people. You want to have a hand anywhere? Anyone? Okay, start with brother there. Now it's Mr.
Hello? Okay, here we go. Hi, my name is Brede Hertzenberg. I work for the Norwegian Army. I have two questions. One goes to, you seem to be very state-centered in your analysis or presentation. Very interesting. By the way, it's not my primary field, so it's interesting to hear. But it seems to me that a lot of the main kind of international actors are multinational corporations. And in terms of your proposed solutions, how do you see engaging them in some sort of framework in order to be able to, because I would see a lot of adversarial activity within their infrastructure. How could you reach them with a NATO MOU, for example? My other question goes to the transition between cyber and more conventional conflict. It'd be interesting to hear more about that transition, and if you see it becoming more likely for cyber attacks to become more conventional attacks soon.
Yeah, I think these are both great questions. Let me start with the second one first. From at least the US perspective, if in some ways cyber bleeds into the more conventional space, it's not necessarily a bad thing, with the notion that at least when it comes to the conventional space, that's where we have already a superiority. So there's very much this notion, how can we achieve superiority in the cyber domain? Having said that, it's been certainly in the early writing, and I still think today, has been a very narrow discussion around cyber, exactly with the point you're making, with the notion that cyberspace has its own logics, and very much kind of this realm of activity takes place outside of the conventional realm of activity, which is not the case at all. And I think it's certainly a weakness or flaw in the existing thinking of the US strategy, because it does turn into much, if we take the two together, it takes us to a much better understanding of what is going on in this space and when it is used. And I think the Iranian example is a key case of that, right? We can only, I think, understand why the US has conducted the cyber operation if we think about the connecting conventional operations that they might want to conduct as well. One more point on this. I think we see across this space, I think we see two different dimensions in which conventional and cyber operations are blended. There is very much of I think the US, but also most of the European allies, and the way they think about it is very much of what I think a sequential interdependence in way these connect, like potentially a cyber operation taking down a radar system. We've seen that, of course, before. And as a result of that, your non-stealthy aircrafts can fly into operational space of an adversary and strike on a certain target. So you get a multiplier effect. You achieve an effect through a cyber operation, and as a result of that, you can conduct a conventional attack. Clearly, in these kind of situations, timing matters a lot, and the certainty of an effect matters a lot too, right? You need to be sure that you can achieve that effect at a given point in time to achieve your conventional effect. That's different than certainly something the way Russia, of course, has thought about it if they want to use cyber as all, which is much more of a kind of a pooled interdependence. We famously saw this in Georgia, where you would say you might conduct a set of kind of DDoS attacks to at least lead to more confusion and disruption within society, and then you roll the tanks over the border as well. Now that's a very different type of way in which these are interdependent, more specifically because your cyber operation does not depend on the conventional operation and the other way around. And so there are less multiplier effects there, but clearly they can be combined in other ways. So that's the kind of the interrelation between cyber and conventional. There is another question there that we could have had of how much can you use cyber capabilities to deal with the conventional threat or the other way around. Which I'm happy to delve into as well. But I wrote a piece on that called "To What Ends Cyber Capabilities? To What Ends?" Exactly addressing that one. On the NATO MOU and how does it bring in the kind of private sector? The NATO MOU doesn't, and I very much easily said, and certainly should be a set of potential solutions as a starting point, and actually in a way as a starting discussion point to kind of get the US going and talking about this discussion, then that it is an overall solution that addresses all the questions that come out of persistent engagement. So let's be very clear on that. The way I got myself out of this, for instance, this piece that I wrote was to literally write 2 sentences at the very end with something like, and you know, the biggest actor that we miss out on this equation is, of course, the private sector. And so in the future, they should have a seat at the table as well, and we should think about different solutions. Now, you asked me about what those solutions are and how should they be brought in. And I don't know whether there is an overarching framework in which they can be brought in, and I really haven't grasped this well yet. I think it will be much more of a nation to private sector company approach that we will see than a kind of an international kind of agreement, certainly, which involves the private sector. I don't think we'll go in that direction. And so there are 2 questions here that I haven't really wrapped my head around. One is on how much then, if of course a company witnesses adversarial activity on their systems, how do they then communicate it to the government in their own country, and how much, if in this case, let's say the US would achieve effect on that, how much would they communicate it to their own government as well? Those kind of questions, I think that's very, very much open, and so I can't give you a clear answer on that. Do you have any other ideas on this?
Yeah, sorry. I think it's difficult because I think especially the biggest private actors are also not within states. You know, they are more truly like almost super national in terms of their organizing structure.
Absolutely, so, and let's face it, those the biggest actors, at least in the last 5 to 6, 7 years, are the key ones to target, not just for their own significance, but because of the access that they have. In the end, we are well aware that it is much more about not establishing your own access, but establishing your access through some of those key companies that are multinational. And so, I think your point is totally right. I don't believe that there is an international framework to as a plaster to simply clarify that, and we'll see certain governments being able to much better deal with that, with a much more historically better relationship with the private sector than others.
Next is Finn Joachim Ruge. Before you ask, because I will ask you, because he works on cybersecurity in the Ministry of Defense and also used to work in NATO. So I'm curious. I mean, there's a defense minister meeting now, and of course a summit coming up, or senior leadership meeting, whatever they call it. Is anything of this on the agenda? And then you can ask a question.
Thank you, Karsten, and thank you, Max, as well, for a very great introduction to a very interesting topic. Persistent engagement and defend forward is not on the agenda on the latest meeting in London.
It's more about the MOU. I was thinking about the MOU.
Yeah, and not as that I'm aware of either that they're discussing this sort of MOU, but it's very good to get inputs from researchers from outside too. And I think personally that it would probably be more beneficial on a bilateral basis than on a multilateral basis to have such agreements, since, as you said, it's very sensitive, but it's an interesting proposal. And I think, well, now to the questions. My question is how this would alter an adversary's actions. And you said you linked it a bit to deterrence, and I've understood that this concept also talks of a framework for deterrence. But how it would work? Would it lead to stability? Would it escalate? Would it de-escalate? Would it actually have an adversary change its actions? And secondly, talking about the norms. In another seminar on this topic, I heard that if it's used wisely, it will create more. It will strengthen international norms, and it will strengthen international law. You mentioned new norms, I think, and I wonder how this will. There are ongoing negotiations now in the UN on the open-ended working group, and there are how this strategy if it does create new norms, how this would, if it would conflict possibly with the other U.S. positions on international law, and also on the work on international law as such. Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you. Thank you for answering questions, Paul.
Yes. So I actually think I could take the two questions a little bit together, but tell me if I missed out on parts of your question. One thing that I didn't want to touch upon right now, because it is also still in US Cyber Command writing, and also some of the people that come out of it, and I've seen a number of iterations of some of those documents, is that I believe that there is a fundamental flaw in the reasoning around norms, and thus it doesn't connect to their earlier discussion on persistent engagement. Now, what do I mean with that? Persistent engagement, as I said, seeks to cause friction. Change, it's not to dissuade an adversary to do X, Y, or Z, right? Changing the perceived cost-benefit analysis, but again, it's to take away some of their tools and their ability to act, right? So it's not about changing the, again, cost-benefit analysis, it's about taking away the tools to act. If you think about the underlying logic that has been now proposed around agreed competition, and the two pieces that have already come out, the logic there is one that we want to constantly engage with the adversary, and by constantly engaging here and there, we create certain focal points of where they are allowed to go and where they are not allowed to go. Right? And so they kind of learn over time through practice, is the argument, not at the UN level where we try to impose norms, but because if we're constantly engaging with them, through that we come to certain areas where we believe there is this space of, again, agreed competition. Now, as I previously mentioned, I think that space of agreed competition is very small. Right? Because what is it then below the threshold that another actor is allowed to do? Where will you let them do certain things? In the past, you would allow them to do OPM because it would be seen as fair game, it would be espionage. Now, no longer, right? OPM is off the table because it creates a strategic effect. But the more important point on why I think it's fundamentally flawed and the two can't come together is because With the persistent engagement one, it's to cause friction, but what you're really doing here is that they learn over time. They learn over time that in certain areas where they go, the costs are higher than the benefits. That's, in the end, the key kind of mechanism through which you want to create this agreed competition. And so the irony here is that you might have a strategy of persistent engagement about causing friction, but the way you want to achieve norms is really one that is fundamentally kind of one about, I would almost say, kind of a deterrence logic. And actually, if you really delve much more deeply into the sources that are used for that, it's no surprise that they come to that conclusion, because they quote Schelling, they quote Herman Kahn, they quote actually many of the nuclear scholars or the conventional kind of Cold War scholars that are out there. And so if you ask me on like how these two fit together, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that at least the way it is in their current writing and in their current drafts, I'm pretty sure that they don't know either. Is my honest answer, and I even dare to say that being recorded. And so that partially answers your question on how this is then connect to the discussion that is going on at the open-ended working group and in the 6 UN GGE process as well. I think I would almost say I think we should see them separate, which then leads to a certain sense of hypocrisy within not just the US but other countries as well. I really wonder to what degree there is a very strong connection between like Markov or State Department and kind of Nakasoni's agenda, and that there is a very clear sense of how these two kind of come together, that we want to propose norms at the top-down level and the bottom-up. Of course, there is a coordination there of like awareness of like how far should we push questions around sovereignty, all those questions, but I don't believe that these are two very clear, well-coordinated lines of strategy that are taking place at this, or lines of tactics that are taking place at the same time to come to the same kind of understanding of where norms should be in this space. We can have another discussion on some of those questions as well.
So there was one more hand somewhere here, wasn't it? There was somewhere there. There was like 3 hands at the same time. No? Okay, let me get to Lars back there.
Hi, my name is Lars Nesvik. I work here at NUPI. I wanted to ask you about if you've seen any kind of alignment retaliation from other states. And I'm thinking in particular of the sort of withdrawal from the international cyber community of Chinese exploit researchers over the last couple of years, so that Chinese researchers on exploits and vulnerabilities over the last couple of years have stopped going to international exploit competitions and sort of kept their exploits and vulnerabilities within China. Do you see that as a adaptation to the US strategy? And if so, how does this create stability?
Let me take this also as kind of in 2 ways, right? One, have we observed kind of changes in behavior following U.S. strategy, and then the second one more specifically about the Chinese community. The first one, I mean, I probably have the same answer actually for both, which is the first one, hard to say, and I don't know. And again, it shows the limitation that the expert and scholarly community has, as much as we want to, and even threat intel community certainly too, about the operational space. And it goes back to my earlier point of it's hard to, for instance, know to what degree actors are hitting back, and it's only sort of official strategy has come out now, 1.5 years ago. Exact questions around retooling and change in operations, I think, will be an iterative process, and some of this will only be realized in a couple of years' time. And so I have an unsatisfactory answer here, is that it's hard to give you a lot of examples of how we have seen actors adapting. On the operational side. It's also hard, I haven't yet, but again, that shows you don't know about the internal politics of a state. If I mentioned previously of like, can this strategy be used for certain domestic constituencies in other countries to propose an increase in whatever investment in their capabilities? I don't have the insight on that, on how it is used. So on the second question, I simply don't know enough about the Chinese expert community, and I would love to know more about it. I can't imagine personally that that's a direct result of US US news strategy. If you have different views on that, I would love to hear. I think it has much more to do with a kind of a broader sense of also a more historical one in China, of creating more control within the Chinese government on what they seek to achieve, and building up a real nation-state capacity rather than a loose set of activities taking place in, of course, in the early periods in which they started to conduct activity. So, but I'm not a Chinese expert either, and so if you know more about Chinese exploit developers, I would love to chat. But there are a few people who still write on this space, right? Like you had, I mean, there are certainly few people which have who publish English sources that give a very good overview of how these developments are taking place within the Chinese exploit community. We don't have the Scott Hendersons anymore that we used to have. But again, if you, I don't know, I don't read Chinese, so I can't give you a perfect answer there.
All right. So we have like 2 more minutes. If anyone want to have the last question, if not, then we say this is it. Thank you so much, Max. It's really, really great. Let's give him a big hand. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure.